Water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the hornets attacked? To be more specific, these four nations are actually just one species, Apis cerana, also known as the Asian honeybee. And while they've mastered the elements, unlike our blue-arrowed friend, these guys show no mercy. The Asian honeybee belongs to the genus Apis, which, while literally meaning bee in Latin, refers to honeybees specifically. It is this genus, which, surprise surprise, includes the majority of honey-producing bees used commercially by beekeepers, including the most common kind, Apis mellifera, also known as the Western or European honeybee. Now this is an interesting species for many reasons, but perhaps the chief cause behind its specialness is the fact that it was one of, if not the first, domesticated insect. And this has led to it becoming the most widespread out of all the bee species, having a native range that spreads Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, while also having been imported by beekeepers throughout the world, and to such an extent that it can be found on every continent besides Antarctica. And yet, ironically, despite having a now global distribution, it is currently extremely rare, if not functionally extinct in the wild, in its native home of Europe. But this shrinking in natural range was not always considered that alarming, because once upon a time, the Asian honeybee and the European honeybee were considered to be variations of the same species. And the reason for this is due to many similarities shared between the two, both physically and behaviorally. For instance, they're both medium-sized bees, hovering between the 10 to 11 millimeter range in size, and they both engage in producing multiple comb nests inside cavities, which is not seen in other Apis species, such as the giant honeybees, who generally create nests consisting of just a singular comb in open areas. But despite these similarities, research has found that they're not actually able to produce offspring together. And when digging further past the superficial behavioral similarities, it becomes very clear that these two species are not at all cut from the same cloth. And this is readily apparent when looking into what happened when Japanese beekeepers tried to import the European honeybee. Unfortunately for the Japanese beekeepers and our friendly European bees, there is one key thing they forgot to take into account, and that is the Asian giant hornet. Now, the name alone should be enough to strike terror into your heart, but just to further drive this home, you should know that the Asian giant hornet is not called giant for funsies, but rather because it is the world's biggest hornet, which is nightmare-inducing to say the least. They can measure up to 2 inches or 5 centimeters long, and can have a wingspan of 3 inches or 7.6 centimeters. But of course, to go along with this massive size, there is also a stinger that is comparatively huge, measuring in at a whopping 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. Which might not sound big, but just to give you some perspective, this is about 250% bigger than that of a regular wasp. And to add fuel to the already potent fire, the venom is incredibly potent. So much so that there have been reports of human fatalities in cases where multiple hornets were attacking simultaneously. So safe to say, you do not want to run into these guys, or fly into them in the case of our European honeybees, as these guys are not only dangerous to humans, but also to pretty much every insect in existence. In fact, hunting other insects is pretty much their MO. They are not only fiercely predatorial, but they also hunt a whole range of medium to large-sized insects, including mantises, which, if you didn't know, are also specialized insect killers. And so considering that giant hornets routinely kill other insects at the top of the food chain, let's just say, good luck to our European honeybees. And unfortunately for them, no luck was had, and Japanese beekeepers quickly found out that these hornets absolutely decimated the European bees, and to such an extent where it's literally not even viable for Western honeybees to survive in Japan unprotected. But, as it just so happens, Japan is one of the countries where Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, calls home. And this species has clearly inhabited Japan for a very long time. So much so that they've actually developed a unique strategy specifically designed to fend off the giant hornet, which can not only repel it, but also kill it. And that is what I like to call firebending. Like I mentioned previously, the Asian honeybees are only around 10 millimeters in size, which makes them tiny in comparison to the giant hornet. But in many ways, they've learned to use this size to their advantage. To be specific, when a hornet enters their hive, these bees don't run. Instead, they execute what might be the most brutal coordinated attack in the insect world. And what I mean by this is that hundreds of worker bees will quickly surround and cover the invading hornet in a tight ball. And then, they do something amazing. They rapidly vibrate their thoracic muscles. Now, you might be wondering how muscle vibrations could possibly save them from a predator that's 5 times their size, and you'd be right to question this, but the answer is like I said before, firebending. To be exact, by vibrating their muscles, they're able to rapidly raise the temperature inside this bee ball, eventually reaching a scorching 47 degrees Celsius or 117 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the bees themselves can survive temperatures of up to 48 to 50 degrees Celsius, but the hornet, despite its intimidating size, apparently cannot. Well, at least it definitely can't when combined with the toxic levels of carbon dioxide that are also produced from the bees at the same time. And just to make sure that the hornet 100% dies, the bees will maintain this deadly sphere for up to 30 minutes or more, essentially both asphyxiating and cooking the hornet alive. And while some bees may die in the process, it does ultimately ensure the colony's survival by preventing the hornet from being able to return to its own nest and summoning reinforcements that could easily wipe out the bees. But besides being able to survive abnormal levels of heat and carbon dioxide, perhaps the most impressive aspect is how these bees somehow manage to coordinate this attack, while also maintaining the temperature to a precise 1 degree margin. Because remember, if they go even slightly over 48 degrees Celsius, they'd cook themselves, but too far under, and the hornet might survive. And this level of teamwork extends beyond their firebending capabilities, as these bees have a communication system that would make Uncle Iroh proud and put even the most advanced human militaries to shame. And that is what scientists like to call the waggle dance. This is a remarkably precise form of communication, where bees convey critical information through movement, or dancing. You see, when a forager bee discovers something important, like a rich source of nectar, they return to the hive and perform a specific figure-8 pattern. And it is actually quite complex, with a surprising amount of information encoded in its movements. For example, the angle of movement relative to the sun indicates direction, while the duration of the waggle portion tells other bees the distance to the target. And then the vigor of the dance indicates the quality or urgency of what they've found. And through this system, a single bee can guide hundreds of its nestmates to a specific location with remarkable accuracy. And what's really interesting is that we actually know how this behavior developed. Kind of. Like many sophisticated behaviors in nature, the waggle dance evolved over millions of years, with the ancestors of modern honeybees likely having started with simple excitatory movements, such as shaking, zigzagging, buzzing, and crashing into their nestmates to encourage foraging. And the reason we know this is that we can actually still see similar behaviors today in other members of the order Hymenoptera, which is the order where honeybees are from. And other members like bumblebees and wasps show this to an extent. But their behavior is much simpler and suggests that this more rudimentary form was the ancestral state. And what's really shocking is that while this behavior is an evolutionary derived trait, it does seem to also rely on a level of learning. Because what researchers have noticed is that different species and subspecies of honeybees have slightly different patterns of dancing, suggesting almost a dialect of sorts. And now this in itself does not indicate the learned aspect, but what does is that these same researchers have observed that different species of honeybees can literally learn to interpret each other's dialect, and eventually come to completely understand it. To be exact, a 2008 study showed that in a mixed colony of Asian and European honeybees, that over time, they learned to interpret and understand each other's waggle dance. And what's more, is that this little dance is not just limited to finding food, but is also an integral part of their defense. When guard bees spot an approaching threat, they don't just randomly alert the hive. They again perform these precise dances to communicate everything from the location of the threat to the type of response needed. But again, the bees do not stop here, as perhaps their most interesting defensive technique, at least visually, is what you might call airbending, or maybe bee bending, a behavior that scientists refer to as wing shimmering. When hornets approach, these guard bees form organized groups below the hive entrance and then perfectly execute timed waves of wing movements. And these synchronized waves basically serve as a warning signal. And remarkably, many hornets will actually retreat when they hear this sound. But if the wing shimmering does not deter the hornets, the bees have another trick up their sleeve, as they've mastered what you might call super speed. You see, when returning to their hive under threat, Asian honeybees can literally cut their flight time in half, making a rapid beeline, get it, straight for their entrance. And while this might not sound remarkable, this adaptation becomes very impressive when you look at the European honeybees, who actually slow down and attempt evasive maneuvers when faced with hornets. And let's just say, the difference between these two strategies is stark. While a European honeybee takes over 4 seconds to cover the last meter of return to their hive during an attack, an Asian honeybee can dart the same distance in less than 0.2 seconds, essentially reducing their exposure to predators by 20 times. And surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, this combination of coordinated wing shimmering and high-speed precision flying proves remarkably effective, as studies show that when both species are present in the same apiary, hornets preferentially target the European bees, successfully catching them at about 3 times the rate of their Asian counterparts. Which is insane considering that again, the European and Asian honeybee are essentially the same from a physical standpoint. Now, with this said, when you're dealing with the largest hornets on Earth, aerial maneuvers are not enough. And so these bees have mastered ground defenses too, which you might call earthbending. To be specific, Asian honeybees employ a rather unusual defense mechanism for their hive. They collect crap, animal feces to be specific. And no, this isn't just some random behavior, but rather a collective defense strategy that also makes them the first honeybees ever documented to show some level of tool use. For example, in Vietnam, researchers have shown that these clever bees will actively forage for and apply spots of animal feces around their nest entrances. And what's really interesting is that this behavior specifically increases after colonies are exposed to either natural hornet attacks or even just the chemical signals that scout hornets use to mark colonies for mass attack. And the bees will continue this increased behavior for days after the attacks even cease, creating a persistent defensive barrier. And shockingly, the effectiveness of this earth-bending defense is remarkable. When researchers compared colonies with different levels of poop spotting, they found that moderate to heavy fecal spotting significantly suppressed hornet attacks. Specifically, hornets spend 77 to 81% less time landed at the entrance and 94% less time chewing on the entrance when confronted with well-feced hives, which to be honest, I don't blame them. And even more impressively, heavily spotted colonies experience far fewer group attacks by multiple hornets too, a crucial advantage since group attacks are what typically lead to a colony's destruction. But this all brings up the question of why would bees, creatures we typically associate with sweet honey and fragrant flowers, resort to such a, well, unsavory strategy, literally. And while researchers are still working to understand the exact mechanism, there are a few strong possibilities. The most straightforward explanation is that the feces act as a physical repellent, as the hornets must approach and chew their way into the small entrances of the hives. But alternatively, and more likely, the bees might be seeking out specific compounds in the feces that repel insects, which is kind of similar to how beetle larvae create defensive fecal shields containing recycled plant compounds that ward off predators. And this could explain why foragers often return to the same spots on dung piles, seemingly carefully selecting their materials. Now what's not clear is that if these defensive compounds are present due to the dung producer's bodily processes, or because they remain in the feces from the plants the animals ate. Additionally, the spots might also work by masking off the colony's odor or the chemical markers that hornet scouts use to guide their nestmates to target colonies. But whatever the case, it's clear that this crap serves as a remarkably effective defensive tool. Now, like everyone knows, to become the Avatar, you must master all of the elements. And that of course includes the final one, water. Now, unlike the others, this is not about combat. It's not flashy, it won't cook a hornet alive, or send it screaming into the sky. But make no mistake, it is nowhere less impressive, as Apis cerana doesn't just drink water, but manipulates it. You see, when the summer heat starts turning the hive into a steam room, it's been observed that worker bees will fan their wings in such a way to reduce the moisture within their nest and any excess heat. And they do this with near surgical accuracy, being able to maintain a specified internal hive temp between 33 and 35.5 degrees Celsius, even if the outside world is swinging from chilly mornings to sweltering afternoons. So this pretty much all goes to say that while Apis cerana might not have the tattoos or the staff, when it comes down to elemental mastery and fighting off adversaries many times its power, these little insects are the real deal. Fire, air, earth, water, all harnessed, weaponized, and choreographed for one purpose: survival. And considering that even giant hornets don't dare to always mess with them, it looks like they ain't doing too bad of a job. Thanks for watching, and until next time on Living Zoo.